For they have transgressed the laws, changed the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore a curse devours the earth, and her inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Hello everybody, this is Gilgamesh, and today we are covering Isaiah chapter 24, and I have a little bit of a new video and audio setup, and it might be horrible, so we'll see how this goes. This is a section of Isaiah that some have dubbed the Apocalypse of Isaiah. It's comprising chapters 24 through 27. Now, I would say that there's not really a broad degree of agreement on the literary cohesiveness of this section. Some do not really feel that these are more than a loose association of chapters. There are a couple of themes that run throughout them. It is not true apocalyptic literature like what we see in the book of Daniel. It lacks some of the elements that we see in this later apocalyptic literature. But the general idea of an apocalypse is the description of an eschaton, a time where the world comes to a crashing end, if you will, where the forces outside of the world take over and we reach some sort of a final state, often centering on destruction of the normal worldly order and the replacement of it with a heavenly or divine order. Now, all of the prophets have this to some degree, and the constant discussion of a day of the Lord is very common. Isaiah himself is often thought of as being somewhat proto-apocalyptic. But I do want to say that there was a very interesting article that I drew upon when I was studying this chapter that I found very interesting, and the title of it is The Everlasting Covenant and the City of Chaos, Intentional Ambiguity and Irony in Isaiah 24. It's by Robert B. Chisholm Jr., and you will find it in Criswell's Theological Review. I'll give a link to it down in the description. But in this, he talks about some of the themes in this, both of trying to identify what is the everlasting covenant that is discussed in this chapter, as well as what is the city of chaos. This city will be referenced in the next two chapters as well, and makes a little bit of the recurrent theme through this section. Now, there is not at all agreement among scholars as to how cohesive this is. Some see it as several different prophecies or poems that have been interlaced together and edited together, and there's certainly some evidence of that perhaps a final editor thematically arranged these various poems to be in this area together, and that is why a theme was sort of created after these had already been written. That is one way to examine it. Probably that is the truth, honestly. We see a lot of that type of thing happening in the section that we just completed, the oracles about the nations, that probably these were given at separate times and in separate ways, and a final compiler or editor decided to group them all together because they seem thematically related. But with that said, this section, chapters 24 through 27, may be seen as something of a capstone on that section, that this is what everything was leading up to, is this final apocalyptic view. And there's some support for that as well. One of the things we're going to see here is at several times in this section, he uses direct quotes from his previous prophecies in the oracles about the nations, that quotes from those show up here. And so it is clear that this is intended as some sort of a culmination or end point of all of these prophecies that we have given about individual nations so far. But here we have gone to a grand and cosmic scale. And one of the things that Chisholm points out is that God's devastating universal judgment reverses creation and reduces the world to chaos. He associates this judgment also with the subduing of chaos and God's establishment of his kingdom on Mount Zion, in somewhat of an irony and an ambiguity, and that's one of the things that Chisholm explores there. One of the two big questions he asks in his paper is, what is the city of chaos, that we'll see referenced in verse 10? And there are multiple ideas of what it could be. One common interpretation is that it is intended to be the city of Babylon. Another one is that it might be an actual historical Moabite city, although I'm less convinced by that one. And the third possibility is that it might be Jerusalem. Now, that's quite a range of possibilities. The question is, can Jerusalem be seen as this city requiring judgment in Isaiah's worldview? And some would say yes, some would say no. The other big question he asks is, what is the everlasting covenant? And there are generally three different possibilities that are put forward for that. One is a theoretical covenant at the creation of the world. I say theoretical because there's nothing in the biblical text that clearly outlines a covenant at the creation. It's assumed, especially by later writers, that there is an implied covenant there, but nothing in the biblical text quite gives us any parameters of what that covenant would be. This is a good possibility because of the very cosmic nature of this apocalypse. It is not focused only on Jerusalem, but it seems to be a worldwide apocalypse. The other possibility, fitting into that same idea of a universal nature, would be the covenant with Noah, which occurs after the flood. This, again, would work well with the idea of a worldwide coverage of this judgment. This also has the advantage that the covenant of Noah was actually referred to as a Berit Olam, an everlasting covenant. There's a good reason to think that this might be the covenant of Noah. There's also language in this that reflects back to the Noah story in several places. And so that could be what Isaiah has in his view. And the third option, of course, is that Isaiah has in his view the Sinai covenant. The problem with the Sinai covenant is that it was not necessarily understood as universal, but was specific to the nation of Israel, and the judgments here seem to be speaking in a very universal fashion of the entire world, and not just the nation of Israel. It also never actually, in the biblical text, refers to the Sinai covenant as the term Berit Olam, an everlasting covenant. Certainly that is implied in several of the things that are said about it, but the phraseology is not used explicitly about the Sinai covenant. But in favor of the Sinai covenant, it does mention a lot of specific laws that have been altered or broken. And the Noahic covenant is very broad and very short. And so there's not a lot of specific laws that you could point to that have been broken in it. And so these three covenants kind of go out there as, what is the everlasting covenant? And I'm not positive if Isaiah thought in terms like modern scholars do. It may be that for him, the everlasting covenant is something grander than any of these and something more ephemeral that couldn't be tied down to a specific biblical passage, but is a broader context of a standard that is applied to the entire world. This would go back to the idea of a covenant at creation, that there is some sort of baseline standard by which God holds the world in his subduing of chaos and bringing about order, that mankind is intended to continue that, and this sort of unspoken covenant is what's involved there, and that these other specific places in Scripture where it talks about specific covenants may be iterations or explanations of that larger, grander covenant. I think that is a more logical position for Isaiah to take, rather than the idea that he's speaking of a specific reference in Scripture. Part of this, of course, that is complicated is we don't know how much of Scripture was finalized and formalized and available to Isaiah in his time. It's not entirely clear at all if he had access to the same volume of the Torah that we have today, if that was available in his time, or how familiar he would be with every last part of it. Certainly, he shows great familiarity with parts of it. But to assume that he is parsing it in the same way that a modern scholar with complete access to the text would do might not be entirely correct. So, as we begin this, though, let's dive into this. We start here on verse 1. Behold, the Lord will empty the earth and make her desolate, and he will twist her surface and scatter her inhabitants. In the judgment of most scholars, this writing here is at least a century and a half later than the original Isaiah, son of Amos. I don't know that I agree with that, and I have to caution that dating text based on stylistic patterns is a very tenuous process and known for its inaccuracy. There will be wide disagreement when you try to use stylistic methods to date a text. More certain is when we date it against historical events, but there are none in this text that we can really point to with any certainty as to what historical events it is referencing. But there is a consensus that we have left the writings of the original Isaiah here, and that this is some type of a later poet, prophet that is expanding upon them. But that is based largely on conjecture. There's really not any sound evidence to show what authorship we're dealing with here or what time frame we're in. But definitely we have gone to this broad apocalyptic view, and one of the reasons why they would like to place it later is they want to put it closer to the book of Daniel, which has more of the ideal prototype of what an apocalypse is. But we have here the idea that the earth is going to be empty and desolate. Now, we're using some fun words here. The word for empty is bokek. It is a very rare word. It is used only 4 times by Isaiah, and 3 of them are in this chapter. It is also used twice by Jeremiah and once by Nahum in chapter 2, verse 3 of Nahum. We think it means to rot or to lay waste. Now, that's the word for empty. The word for desolate is very similar. It is boka. So we have bokek, empty, and boka, desolate. Now, this word is also rare. It's even more rare. It is only used here in this verse and in one place in Nahum, chapter 2, verse 11. For 2 very rare words to both be used closely together in Isaiah 24 and in Nahum chapter 2, it seems to stretch coincidence a bit. I would guess that the one text must have been influenced by the other. If you're looking this up, by the way, do note that the Christian numbering of the verse and the traditional Jewish numbering of the verses is slightly off in Nahum too. So if you're having trouble finding the verse that I'm referencing, that's what's going on. This opening here has me recalling the opening of Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Even though they use different words there, they use sound play there for tohu and vohu, words that rhyme here. Here we're using bokek and boka. Again, a sound play here, and the meaning of the words seems to be largely similar, that we're talking about emptiness and waste in both of these. And in both of them, we have some rather unusual and uncommon words. The word vohu is really only used there and in other verses that are clearly quoting that verse. So it might even be, as Robert Alter suggested, a nonce word that was invented to rhyme with the other word. But this does seem that this has some callback to creation in it immediately, that we are undoing creation and bringing it back to that disordered state of unorganized matter. Then it says, he will twist her surface. The word twist here is a word that actually means to do wickedness. In Lamentations chapter 3, verse 9, it is used to refer to making paths twisted or crooked. And of course, the theme of making the crooked straight comes up many times in Isaiah. And the word for straight is a word that means righteousness or upright or just. And so the idea that the word for crooked would mean wicked or unjust or violating of laws makes sense. But it's important to realize that these words here of twisted and straight have moral equivalents in Isaiah's language as well. Now he goes through, starting in verse 2 here, different groups of people, and they're all classed in pairs. It says here in verse 2, and it shall be, as with the people, so with the priest, as with the slave, so with his master, as with the slave girl, so with her mistress, as with the buyer, so with the seller, as with the lender, so with the borrower, as with the creditor, so with the debtor. It's interesting, he's listing a lot of pairs of people and tends to put them as social opposites. Those that are on the lowest tiers of society, those are on the highest tiers. It is interesting that he puts people and priests as opposites, but he also has creditors and debtors and slaves and masters. The idea here is that this is all encompassing of all people of all classes and positions. There is no one who is not going to be affected by this reversal of creation. And we come here to verse 3. Utterly empty shall be the earth, and utterly plundered, for the Lord has spoken this word. So notice here the repeated word utterly. This is a translation convention here because we cannot faithfully recreate the effect in English that we have in Hebrew. In Hebrew, there is a verbal form called the infinitive absolute that is used quite commonly. You use this infinitive verb form just before an ordinary finite verb, and it expresses intensity or certainty. We see it in phrases like back in the Garden of Eden, where God warns of eating the fruit, saying something like, "Dying you shall die." And we translate it a little more nicely in English, "You shall surely die," because we don't quite use infinitives before regular verbs like that for intensity in English, so we have to come up with something equivalent in English. Here the text has something like, "Emptying, she shall be empty, the earth." It's a neat effect because it makes this natural sound repetition, which is a constant theme throughout this chapter, is these sound plays and these sound repetitions. So in Hebrew, this is hibok tibok. And then following that, it is hibos tibos. These are two different verbs, but they already have some notable sound similarities between hibok and hibos. And in the Hebrew, where we are repeating each verb essentially twice, it makes these four words that are pretty much right in a row with one other word, haaretz, in the middle there. But it makes this very distinct, repetitive sound, almost musical sound that we get into here as we give this rather tough prophecy here of utterly empty shall be the earth and utterly plundered. But it is very repetitive and distinct in its sound play. Then we move into verse 4. It says, "The earth mourns and withers. The world languishes and withers. The highest people of the earth languish." This has this interesting repetition again of various verbs are repeated here with the word withers and the word languish occurring twice. We're going to actually bring these verbs back a few verses later on when we talk about the grape harvest. And Isaiah does this to make connections between different parts of the text. In this case, he is connecting the people and the civilization to the agricultural produce of the land. Now, the word mourns here actually has a bit of a dual meaning in Hebrew. There are homonyms for it that can mean both to mourn and also to dry up. And so Isaiah is playing on both of these meanings here, that the people are mourning, the earth is mourning, but also that the earth is drying up and that the agricultural produce is being destroyed. And so there's this connection between people and civilization and the agriculture that they produce. He continues with this idea here. "The earth lies defiled under her inhabitants." This is a recurrent biblical notion that corrupt behavior pollutes the earth. It is perhaps because of this that the earth must be broken into pieces in the coming verses. The very presence of wicked people on the earth is polluting it. And how have they done so? That's where we get into here in the last half of verse 5. "For they have transgressed the laws, changed the statutes, and broken the everlasting covenant," the Barit Olam. "Therefore a curse devours the earth, and her inhabitants suffer for their guilt." The idea here that they have violated or changed the statutes seems to be that they are condemning some sort of a changing of the law. And we're not clear what that would be. But again, this doesn't seem to be necessarily limited to Israel. It seems to be worldwide, that there is a violation of these laws and these statutes that all the world should have been obeying that are now being transgressed. So it's hard to put this into the terms of the Sinai covenant, but here we are specifically talking about laws and statutes, which sounds very specific and the Sinai covenant is full of. But because of this, because they have either changed or broken these statutes, a curse. The Hebrew word is Allah. And Allah is a curse that is often associated with a covenant, that it devours or eats up the earth, and her inhabitants suffer because they are guilty. In ancient Near Eastern treaties, there were often curses or threatened judgments that were attached to them. Deuteronomy 28 is a great example of such a curse. The party or parties take an oath of allegiance, acknowledge that disobedience would activate these curses, which typically threatened loss of agricultural fertility, as we have depicted in these verses here. So the idea is that when you enter into a covenant with God, there are penalties that are often attached to that, and the violation of that covenant will bring about the judgment of God upon you as a result of your failure to walk up to that covenant. And that is what we're saying is happening here, is that the earth is polluted because of those on it that have transgressed these laws, and they have now activated the Allah, the curse that will come upon them from this. This next one, we're not quite sure what the last word means. It says, therefore the inhabitants of the earth are scorched, and few men are left. This word scorched, there's basically three ideas of what it could mean. The way that it's written here, it looks most likely that it is to burn, scorched, but that also can mean symbolically to become angry. So therefore the inhabitants of the earth are quite mad. That isn't quite the right reaction here. So we look at this, the Dead Sea Scrolls actually have a slightly different spelling on this. They have Ket Vav Resh Vav here, and we think that that might come to a root which means to grow pale. And so it might be saying here that the inhabitants of the earth grow pale. That would make more sense with being terrified. There is, however, an Arabic cognate that means to decrease. And that would work well with the next line here, that therefore the inhabitants of the earth decrease and few men are left. That actually works pretty nicely, and probably the one that's most convincing to me, but we're not entirely sure what this last word means on this verse here. But something bad, definitely, is happening to the inhabitants of the earth, and there's not very many people left. Now, the word few, when we say few men are left, this is an interesting word. It is only used in Isaiah, and he uses it 4 times. But we actually see no other biblical writer use this word for few. So that's sort of an interesting, unique Isaiah-ism. And again, goes to the idea that this might be the same writer as we had in the earlier chapters of Isaiah. It seems a likely word that is indicative of his vocabulary. Interestingly, it does only occur in the first half of the book. So for those who would like to see 2 Isaiahs at least, this would be a word that supports that it's used 4 times in the first half of the book, but not at all in the second half. That also could just be coincidence. But now we're going to bring this back to the grape harvest, here in verse 7. The wine mourns, the vine languishes, all the merry-hearted sigh. So we have here the verbs mourn and languish that are repeated from verse 4. Although the third verb, wither, has been replaced with a different verb here, which means to sigh. Now, the word for wine here is not our usual word for wine. It comes from a root that means to be pressed out. It is believed to refer to either freshly pressed or possibly unfermented wine. So we are talking about the gathering of grapes here that is normally a thing that is associated with joy, with community, with the making of wine, which also is a symbol of joy. All of that is falling apart. We come to verse 8, and we can imagine the joyful celebrations often associated with harvesting the grapes here. The mirth of the tambourines is stilled. The noise of the jubilant has ceased. The mirth of the lyre is stilled. The word for tambourine here is the Hebrew word tuf, and we don't know exactly what it is, but it was some kind of a hand drum. A tambourine is probably a pretty good guess. It probably was quite similar to that. Rhythmic instruments are older than written history, and every culture has enjoyed using them to aid in their dancing and their singing, and so this was some type of a hand drum that would have provided a rhythmic accompaniment. The lyre here is the Hebrew word kinor, and we know a bit about what those look like, that they were 12 stringed. Here's a picture of one that is represented on a seal. This is a seal in jasper that was found in Jerusalem, and you can see it has 12 strings and an oblique crossbar across the top there, and on the bottom is a sound box to amplify its sound, and it's decorated with a line of pearls around its edges, and also a rosette in its center. And the Hebrew inscription on it appears a mirror image because this is a seal that would be pressed into clay, and so you'd see the reverse of it. The Hebrew says belonging to Ma'adana, the king's daughter. But this is what a lyre would look like, and this king's daughter would probably have been involved in some of the musical accompaniments for some of these celebrations. It would be a large communal thing. We have verse 9 here. With a song they no more drink wine. Bitter is beer to drink it. Now here we have the normal word for wine, normal fermented wine, and I put the translation to be a little closer to the Hebrew on this, even though it's a little unusual to say it this way in English. But we're probably using multiple words here for wine for poetic purposes, and then we also go to the word for beer, which this is a drink that was made from barley. And so we're kind of mixing together all of our different drinks that we have here in Israel. But the idea is that the celebration, the partying, isn't happening anymore. It was a time of music and of singing, and it's now turned bitter. Then we have verse 10 here. The city of chaos is broken down. Every house is shut up so that none can enter. The city of chaos, a lot of translations take a lot of different words for this, the futile city, the desolate city, but the word here is the city of tohu. Tohu can mean chaos. It is one of the words that was used to describe the earth that we've already mentioned back in Genesis 1:2, that the earth was tohu and vohu. This is that same word. This is a city of chaos, a city of uncreation. And it has been broken down, and every house is shut up so that none can enter. Now, it is interesting here, this Hebrew here for every house is shut up, kol bayit mibo. It's very similar to the phrase that we had in the last chapter, which was mibayit mibo. There, we were talking about the sailors coming back to Tarshish, and we weren't sure what mibo meant. And it was rendered as harbor, but I mentioned that it really means entrance. This is very similar wording here, and it's saying here that every house is shut up so that none can enter, whereas in the previous chapter it was destroyed from entering, which was challenging to translate in any way. But this could be a direct reference back to that verse in the last chapter. And this, again, is how Isaiah tends to connect things. And I mentioned that this section of Isaiah calls back to the previous sections on the oracles about the nations, and this is one of those examples. This seems to be a callback to the last chapter there, where the city of chaos has been destroyed and every house is shut up so that it cannot enter. Some scholars prefer to see this city of chaos in verse 10 as symbolic. I'm reading from Chisholm here. Typical or representative of world power, human society, or an ancient city-state culture. Others attempt to identify it with a historical city such as Jerusalem, Babylon, or an unidentified Moabite city, a typical or symbolic city. Several factors favor identifying the city of chaos as a type of symbol of all-around proud cities which oppose God's authority and become objects of his judgment. This unnamed city is described in general, even stereotypical fashion. It contains houses, streets, and a gate, and is characterized by revelry. The city's downfall is closely associated with a universal judgment that reverses the creative order. In fact, the world's inhabitants seem to be the city's residents. In verses 10 through 12, the bicolon, all your joy turns to gloom and all your gaiety is banished from the earth, appears between references to the city's demise. After the description of the city's fall in verse 13, it observes, so it will be on the earth among the nations. Finally, following the oracles of chapters 13 through 23, those would be the oracles about the nations, which anticipate the downfall of various specific cities, a reference to a typical or representative city would be appropriate here. I think Chisholm makes a very good argument for this, that this city might be the world in general and not a specific earthly city. That seems to be the most logical implication of what Isaiah is saying here. But the idea that it could be Babylon or Jerusalem is itself an interesting question. Is there a point where Jerusalem becomes Babylon? Is the evil of the world something that is always external to Zion? One of the overarching themes of Isaiah is to flee Babylon and seek refuge in Zion. Yet, he also at various points warns that Zion itself can fall if it adopts Babylon's ways. These themes are much less about historical cities than they are about larger symbolic issues. So as we come to verse 11, we're still talking about the wine and the partying here. There's an outcry in the streets for lack of wine. All joy has grown dark. The gladness of the earth is banished. The city is horror and waste. The gates battered. Again, this bleak outlook of the destroyed city. And the city is horror and waste. These are, again, a bit of sound play here. We have the words Shema and Sha'ia. The second word occurs nowhere else, and the translation of it is just a guess based on context. It must mean something similar to horror or destruction based on its placement in the sentence. Although some would place the second word here down into the next clause next to the gates and translate it as the gates lie there smashed in utter destruction. So that is also a possibility. We're not entirely positive it should be paired with a description of the city, but might be a description of the gates. Difficult to say. Moving on to verse 13. For thus it shall be in the midst of the earth among the peoples, as when an olive tree is beaten, as the gleaning when the grape harvest is done. So again, we have this tie-in to the grape harvest, and this is how it's going to be everywhere, like after the olive harvest, like after the grape harvest, the two major crops of Israel here, when there's just not a lot left. Now, this image of the beaten olive tree, where you'd beat the tree trying to knock down any of the last few olives that the pickers didn't get to, it is clearly a reference to Isaiah 17:6, back in our oracles about the nations. This is a prophecy that is discussing the demise of Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel. And it is actually the only other place in the Hebrew Bible where this verb occurs, this verb to beat an olive tree. It's a very specific verb. The verb for gleaning is also uncommon, and it also appears in Isaiah chapter 17, verse 6 as well, although it also does occur in a few other places also. But this seems to clearly be a reference back to Isaiah 17:6. So we're bringing in that destruction into this one, that there won't be much left, just like after harvest, where there's only a few grapes or olives left that have to take great work to find them. Then we come into something very odd here with verse 14. This seems to be some sort of interjection. Maybe it was getting too much gloom and doom, and so we now take a break here to remind everybody that the world is not completely awful. But we have this little break into a poetic section here that goes through verse 14 and the first half of 16, before then returning back to our view of gloom and doom. And it's not clear if this was originally in there, if a later editor decided to insert it here to break up some of the gloom and doom, if perhaps these, again, are multiple poems that have been put together thematically, and they decided to put a little bit of a bright and happy moment between two other poems, because this also could have been a nice ending for this poem here, with leaving it like the olive tree that's beaten. That's a nice concluding thought. So this definitely doesn't seem to be quite flowing smoothly with what comes before. We have this very sudden break in verse 14. It says, they lift up their voices, they sing for joy over the majesty of the Lord. They shout from the west, exult in the east. Give glory to the Lord in the coastlands of the sea, the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. From the wing of the earth we hear songs of praise, of splendor to the righteous one. So this very exultant, very poetic idea that the whole earth is bursting forth and singing to the Lord. Seems to have nothing to do with what we were just talking about. Well, the word for west here is literally from the sea, which refers to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. These people actually had no idea what an ocean was. The Mediterranean was the biggest sea they knew. So when they say from the sea, they're referring to a cardinal direction of the west. And then this word here for exult. The traditional text actually reads therefore, but it's generally agreed that this is an error and it should be corrected to the word that means exult, which is ilzu, and is spelled somewhat similarly to the phrase therefore. We think that it was just a scribal error that got them mixed up. It makes much more sense for it to be exult. And the word for east, well, you'll see in some translations, the King James translation actually has the word fires here to praise him in the fires, which is really strange. The word, though, actually comes from a root that means light, and it can refer to firelight, but it's also believed to refer to the light of the rising of the sun, and thus the east. Another proposal is that it might be a scribal error and should read as two different words, Ba'iye Hayam, the Isles of the Sea, a phrase that appears right after it. And then the parallel would not be east and west, but from the sea or Isles of the Sea. I can see both arguments. I think that originally this verse was a little bit more of a clear chiasm. There's obviously some structure going on here, but I wonder if the structure did get messed up a little bit by someone trying to correct the text after an error had crept in. So I'm not sure we can clearly say what happened in this verse. Some translations also will translate verse 16 as from the end of the earth. That's a phrase we know in English well. The Hebrew literally says the wing of the earth. It means the same thing, but I like the idea of wing. I think that's a very poetic idea, that they're out there on the wing of the earth, and even in this far remote land they are praising. After this brief, almost chiasm of hope, let's get back to the destruction. And I say, I waste away, woe is me. In this chapter, this is the only really difficult line. No one's really quite sure what it means, but it is definitely a sound play of some kind. I waste away, razi li, oi li, is what it says here. It's very distinct. Some guesses about what it might mean is, it is my secret, That's one possibility. I pine away. That's kind of where we get the waste away idea from. And I am a villain. So we have no idea what this is saying. None of these make great sense in context. Our biggest clue is the woe is me, which tells us that whatever phrase this is, it should be something that is distressing to the speaker. Of course, it also isn't clear who the speaker is either. Is this the prophet speaking? Is this the people speaking? It's nobody knows. And so we're just having to guess. Robert Alter thought that the best construction was I have a secret, and he links that with what follows with the idea of betrayal. And maybe that's what's going on. Maybe that's the best way to put this. But I think that this second half of verse 16 here represents a new poem, a new thought that's not really related to the praise that is immediately before it. I think that was just simply a intermission between two poems here. So we come in with verse 16. For the traitors have betrayed. With betrayal, the traitors have betrayed. So the second half of this line is really fun. It is 5 words long in Hebrew, and all 5 words come from the same root, which is the letters Beit Gimel Dalet. And it means treacherous. It makes this whole verse very musical. We have razi li, oi li, bogdim bagadu, uveged bogdim bagadu. And yeah, it's just very repetitive, very musical. And then we follow that up with 3 other words that sound alike, where we're going to have pachad, fachat, and fach, for terror, pit, and snare. So a lot of repetition, a lot of sound play in this. But yes, the idea here is that perhaps he's saying he has a secret, and there has been this great betrayal that has happened. That the betraying betrayers have betrayed betrayingly. But then we come to verse 17, and we have the terror and the pit and the snare. These words all sound similar in Hebrew. Are upon you, O inhabitant of the earth. He who flees at the sound of terror shall fall into the pit, and he who climbs out of the pit shall be caught in the snare. So this, with the idea of betrayal, sounds like we are harming each other. That we'll be terrified, we'll have traps set for each other, we will be harming one another. So again, the Hebrew here has pachad, vayafat, vayafach. And they all sound very similar. And Robert Alter came up with an English equivalent here that he thought was good. Terror and tripwire and trap. I thought that was creative. But yes, the basic idea here is that anyone who tries to escape from this calamity will be caught. And it sounds like they will be caught by others who have set these pits and traps. Now we come into some definite Noah kind of wording here. For the windows of heaven are opened, and the foundations of the earth tremble. The windows of heaven are referenced in Genesis chapter 7, verses 11, and the story of the flood. On that day, all the foundations of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened, suggesting that water was coming from the great deep, the Tehom, and also that these windows in heaven would be opened and pour out water. So we had water coming from below and above in the Noah flood as we reverse creation there. Here we have something very similar. Now, interestingly, the word for heaven, the normal word for heaven, shemaim, is not what's used in this verse. This verse changes it up a bit and uses a word that means on high. So the windows on high. But he does it several times in this chapter. I think 3 times this chapter uses this word as a stand-in for heaven. And so it's clear that perhaps the writer is trying not to be cliche in his terms. He's using up different terms for poetic effect, but it seems clear that this is the same kind of reference here, these windows above that can be opened up to bring in floodgates of water. And so that, along with the foundations of the earth trembling, gives us this very much Noah imagery. We have in verse 19, the earth is utterly shattered. The earth is utterly split apart. The earth is utterly shaken. The earth utterly staggers. Like a drunken man, it sways like a hut. Notice utterly repeated so many times there. This, again, is that Hebrew verbal form that's unique there, the infinitive absolute. It occurs 4 times in a row. It consists of 2 verbs together, and I've represented it here in the translation when it's repeating utterly, but it has this very repetitive sound when placed in the Hebrew that brings a lot of attention to it. Now, each of these lines also ends with the same word, the Hebrew word eretz, which is earth. And each line also uses a unusual Hebrew verb form called the hitpolel. This is a verb where the third letter of the 3-letter stem repeats itself. For non-Hebrew speakers, I don't know a good way to make that easier, but it means that the final consonant repeats itself as well. So it's a very interesting, unusual thing, makes it a very distinct and verse that just really jumps off the page at you for this very repetitive nature of it. And then it continues on, her rebellion lies heavy upon it, and she falls, and she will not rise again. This seems to go back to this pit imagery, and here we are talking about the earth herself, that her rebellion, the rebellion of the people who have lived on the earth, are heavy upon the earth, and she's going to fall and not rise again. And then in 21, we now have a very interesting verse here. And it shall come to pass in that day, the Lord will visit the host of heaven in heaven, and the kings of the earth on the earth. Now, this word for heaven, again, is not the typical word for heaven, shemaim, but it is actually that same word we used earlier for on high, that the hosts of on high in on high. It is clearly, again, we would normally say the hosts of heaven it's clearly being used as a stand-in for Shemayim. Now, why the hosts of heaven? It's a little unclear here. What have the hosts of heaven done wrong that they should be brought into judgment here? Well, the hosts of heaven, of course, generally referred to the stars. And so this was a bit of a cosmic reference. And what we're saying here, it seems to be, is that this judgment will not be limited merely to the terrestrial sphere of the earth, but it's going to encompass the heavens as well, that both the sky above them and the land below them would be part of this great global catastrophe. So all of creation would be consumed in this uncreation act, more so than what we could point to in like the flood, where the heavens were not really affected by the floodwaters. Here, the very heavens, the hosts of heaven, the stars of the sky, will actually be brought down into this judgment. Now, the word for visit here, some translations translate it as punish. The word really means to visit or to take note of. And sometimes the Lord visits with destruction, but this word doesn't really mean to punish. He also frequently visits with deliverance. And this is the sense that it's used several times in Exodus, where the same word is used, like in Exodus 3:16 or 4:31 or 13:19. There it is to take notice of and to visit them with deliverance. And it's going to be used that way in the next verse. So the ambiguity of this word to be both a visit with punishment or a visit with deliverance seems to be used by Isaiah intentionally here again, with intentionally leaning into some of these ambiguities of the words. But after we have declared that this is going to be universal and cosmic, we then have 22 here. They will be bounded as captives in a pit. They will be imprisoned in a prison. And after many days, they will be visited. So they'll be bounded as captives in a pit. Some people will think that the repetition in this one is a dideographic or a gloss, but that seems very unlikely since this whole chapter has been about repetition and sound play. I think it's very intentional here. He's just bringing emphasis here that all of the cosmos here is going to be bound into this captive state inside the pit. We're back to the idea of a pit. And they're going to be imprisoned for a long time. Then after many days, they will be visited. So we visited the kings of the earth and the hosts of heaven and brought them into destruction, brought them into the pit, and then after a long time they are going to be visited again, perhaps to bring them out of the pit. From verse 17 on, we've had a very unified theme. The earth groans under the weight of its sins and falls into the pit where it cannot get out of. And these verses have emphasized that there's no escape from terror, pit, and snare. The stars above and the kings below are all subject to this fate. All of them go to this prison, this pit where no traveler can return. And then after many days, they will be visited. I believe that Isaiah may have been beginning to come upon the idea of the resurrection of the dead in this statement here, that this is the beginning of that doctrine that is beginning to be established in Isaiah here. Going back to Chisholm, he says, Isaiah 24 describes this coming judgment in particularly vivid detail. According to verse 5, the earth's inhabitants have disobeyed its laws, violated the statutes, and broken the everlasting covenant. This rebellion, mentioned in verse 20, prompts God to implement against them the covenantal curse, in verse 6, which in typical fashion brings with it widespread infertility and sorrow in verses 4 and also 7 through 11. The judgment, which is accompanied by a torrential downpour reminiscent of the Noahic flood, and by an earthquake, which rocks the earth to its very core in verses 18 through 19, brings total, inescapable, verses 17 to 18, and final, verse 20, destruction. In conjunction with this judgment, the prophet anticipates the downfall of an unidentified city in verses 10 through 12, which is contrasted with the restored Zion in verse 23. In short, this divine judgment at least partially reverses creation by reducing the earth to a marred and virtually uninhabited state, approximating the unformed and unfilled condition which prevailed prior to God's creative work in Genesis 1:2. So, nice summary of the chapter there, and he leads to verse 23 here. The first part of it is a little bit unclear. Then the moon will be confounded and the sun ashamed. Now, there are two thoughts really on what this line might mean. it might be talking still about the universality of the destruction, that like the hosts of heaven that would be brought down, that even the sun and the moon will be brought down. The other idea is that since they're going to be ashamed or confounded, it will be because there is something brighter and more majestic than they are. And that's what goes with the second half of this verse right here. For the Lord of hosts reigns on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before his elders. So it could be that the sun and the moon are embarrassed because their bright light is now outshone by the Lord himself, who is in Mount Zion. So we have this idea that they're going to be bound in the pit, but after many days they get visited, and then the Lord is reigning in Mount Zion. So this idea of a reversal of fortunes, bringing the final element of this apocalyptic literature to its logical conclusion here, that the earthly order is destroyed and a new cosmic order is put in place. Now, the word his in his glory actually isn't in the text, but the Septuagint, the Syriac, and the Vulgate suggest that perhaps this should be read as a passive verb, and that last line should be, and he will be glorified before his elders. That is also a possibility of how that last line could be translated. But that brings it to a conclusion there. We have the cosmic order destroyed. Everything, both in heaven and earth, brought to an end, possibly by our own doing, well, definitely by our own doing, by violating the covenants and bringing upon ourselves the covenantal penalty, and then being replaced with a new order with the Lord himself reigning in Mount Zion. And I will leave it there, and we'll take it up in the next chapter. Thank you for listening this far. Please give me a like and a subscribe so that we can help the channel grow and reach more people. Thank you very much. See you later.